Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of the Testing Peers podcast. Tonight, we're going to be talking about testability. It's a relevant topic, it's an interesting topic, and we're going to delve deep into the recesses of what testability is. And tonight, we're going to be joined by Al.
Hello.
And the usual suspects, Russell.
Hey there.
And Chris.
Well, hello there.
And myself, David. Hello. We can't do this without our wonderful sponsor, and Enfocus are our sponsor, and they are a UK-based software testing company. They've been supporting the business for 24 years by providing services that include burst resource, accelerated test automation, performance testing, and fully managed testing services. In 2021, they launched the Test Automation Academy to create amazing testers, and so far they have created jobs for 48 people in the testing industry in just under 3 years, which is brilliant news and great for the industry. If you want to contact them, you can look at their website at enfocus.co.uk or email them at info@enfocus.co.uk. As is usual for the podcast, we are going to go to banter, and tonight it's Al that's going to surprise us with the topic.
Thank you very much, David. I was thinking about things that we can talk about, and strangely, I'm staring at my bookcase from across the living room, and I want to talk about books, but not just any books that you collect. So I have, for anybody that's seen me or had the pleasure of listening to me talk, will know that I've got a collection of hardback first editions of various techno-thrillers by the likes of Le Carre, Tom Clancy, Craig Thomas, etc. And I'm staring at the bookshelf and I'm trying to think what my most favourite book is. And I'm torn. I can't choose between, and this is where it gets really niche, so I'm probably about to lose half the audience here. It's like, oh no, he's about to talk about techno-thrillers. I'm torn between Firefox by Craig Thomas and The Hunt for Red October by Tom Clancy, and I really can't choose between the two. So I guess the topic is what books do you like to collect, and can you ever choose a favourite?
I have two categories that I fall into. Books that I want to collect because they look nice on my shelf, and books that I'm likely to read, which will more likely be ebooks. The books that look nice on my shelf, I've got a complete Encyclopedia Britannica from 1988, which is brown leather bound. It looks very pretty. It was the one thing when my parents were downsizing when they retired that I said, that's what I want. And they're utterly useless because they're completely out of date. But I love it. And it looks great, and it makes me feel half like I'm in a library. But in terms of books that I actually read that I like to collect, there are obviously there's a lot of interesting professional books, but the ones I would read for pleasure typically are the ones by the author Jonason, are the ones I will pre-order without even reading a blurb. And of those, probably the first one, the 100-year-old man who climbed out of a window and disappeared, would be my favourite.
It's a tough one for me. I don't really collect books, but then I've just looked to my left and I have a collection of books. So you to put those two sentences together and make sense of that. A lot of my books are digital as well these days. So I'm just thinking, so if I collect anything, I'm sad and collect kind of IT books, testing books, books on kind of behavioural kind of psychology and things like that. I've forgotten the second part of the question, to be honest. Was it favourite?
Yeah, can you choose a
Do you
favourite?
ever really have a
Can you choose
favourite?
Yeah, I do have a favourite, but it's probably a selection of favourites. So George Orwell's sort of Down Out in Paris and London is probably one of my favourites. Otherwise, it's sort of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Douglas Adams. So I'm torn between those two. It depends on my mood, which direction I go in.
When you say Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, is that the as in the series Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or just the book Hitchhiker's Guide to the
I'll
Galaxy?
say the book because the series would be cheating. I think. It's not a quadrilogy, quintrilogy that it is now, as originally a trilogy. So I would go with the original first edition, kind of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy type thing.
So for me, in terms of collecting, I've probably got sort of some of the classics, not necessarily in first edition or whatever, but some of those really good classics are good to have. One thing I have bought, because I had some money a couple of Christmases ago, so I bought a hardback version of Moonraker, the James Bond. It's supposed to be better as a book than it is a film. I haven't actually read it yet, but I've got that. That's a really nice thing, so I chose to have that. In terms of favorite book, I probably don't have a particular favorite as such. I do quite like a thriller, so Lee Child, but someone I'm into at the moment is Harlan Coben. There's some TV programs about that as well. I quite like the way his books are written, so therefore you don't, they're quite complicated because you can't actually guess what the actual outcome is going to be, which is always good with a thriller. So there we go. Let's go on to testability. So Russell, you were the one who suggested this topic today, so let's cross over to you.
Yeah, so I was interested and involved in a conversation today about testability, and I had to think a little bit long and hard about what it meant to me, what it meant in the context. So I thought that's a great topic. It's a wider discussion so we can have. It's an interesting area. So I kind of looked into it a little bit, and in effect, my understanding of it is it's that ability, hence the testability, to kind of see how easy or effective, efficient, all those sorts of words, it is to do testing on a given context. So it could be software, it could be hardware, it could be testability of a component of software, it could be of the whole system. So it depends on how you frame it. Testability can also be of a design, could be of an idea. It doesn't have to be software. But for the benefit of us podcasters here today, and probably let's keep it around the software hardware sort of space. But what are the sort of things do you think kind of come in under testability? Where do you think we do well at testability? And I'm going to throw loads of questions out there. Where do you think we are perhaps as software engineers, software people, not so good at considering it, planning for it, investing in it, advocating for it, all those sorts of things? That's kind of the theme, but let's take one of them. So let's start with that. How do people think we are with testability in general in the software test hardware space? Think we've mastered it?
I don't think we've mastered it. I think that, to quote from you guys, I think it's very context driven. There you go. Whee. I'm not trying to say that to be passe or anything, but because to say that kind of is neatly avoiding trying to actually answer that. So I think that it's not necessarily knowing how you should test something in terms of, oh yeah, we always want to test as early as possible on the smallest component in order to de-scope the risk. It's also, I think, knowing at what point does the testing actually provide value so that you could actually move forward with it. Because I could give you a line of code and say, test this. All right, but is that actually valuable? Is it testable? Probably. But is it valuable?
It depends.
There it goes. So, exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess there is a lot of context around that. But have we mastered it? No, because it changes.
Yeah,
and the answer changes.
I think that makes sense. Yeah. How about you guys, David, Chris?
Well, I was going to say that isn't testability partly on understanding the design of the actual thing itself, design of the software that you're doing, but also the design of the test framework or the test infrastructure that you're actually doing? Because I think it's driven by lots of things. It's driven by, the design, but also the complexity, but also the longevity of it. Sometimes you can throw together very quick scripts for a small thing, but then it can then manifest itself into a much larger beast that you then have to test. And if you've just concentrated on those small scripts, you are automatically putting in technical debt in order to then undo it. And I think that technical debt can unhinge the testability of a particular thing. I think that with hardware test, we're probably a little closer because often there is a finite number of options with hardware test. It either works or it doesn't, or these components work together, or whichever bits you put together with integration or a single particular module, whatever, you do get results and you either get it correct or it doesn't actually work. So I'd say hardware test is probably a little more easier to define and easier to get testability than it is with software, which is a bit more fluid and can be scuppered by a bad design or a bad test framework.
I've seen testability work normally best early stage in development of products when maybe a full product isn't going to be available in production like environment. So things have been able to create, debuggy testable elements to sort of get to parts to make them testable sooner. But I've also noted that once there is something production testable, very often that testability can drop away, get out of sync, almost as if you branched off and you forgot to merge back in later, and that version of whatever you're testing becomes null and void. It's not something you should be accessing. It's almost like it's tech debt because it isn't maintained. And I think that's true with a lot of things where you might find pockets of good testable code in amongst your stuff where maybe there was a drive for it, or maybe there was time for it. But I imagine when there's a squeeze, quite often that is somewhere that's going to lose the attention that it maybe you would want it to have.
It is a huge topic, I have to say, and I have made it really broad. So yeah, if any of you said we'd mastered it, I'd been shocked, because part of it, obviously, in my head, is about being able to observe it. So you need, in order to be able to know whether something is working as expected or tested, in my head, you need to be observing. We ain't mastered observability yet, and at any level of the system, be it units all the way up. It's part of it is about understanding risk, about trying to figure out what's important. To David's point, if you're going to do a disposable thing, then the testability requirements, the need for how easy it is, effort versus reward, is different. You're not going to make it the most testable thing and you can do scalability tests, performance tests, all these sorts of things if actually the point is to get it in front of 10 people and that's all you care about. You don't need it to do a performance test of 1 billion users like Facebook or something. So you have to adapt to the context, as we said. There's so many facets to it, though. I find it really interesting. And one of the things I think as testers, we can build our automation frameworks and our frameworks quite well, but actually it's not about the tests necessarily being built well. It's the application, it's the architecture, it's the environments, it's the data, it's the context of where the testing is taking place. I think that's a really key point of why there's so much value in getting involved early, because it's shaping that of, well, have you thought about this? We need this. You're doing this. What's happening here? How are we versioning it? Things like that. The amount, I think that goes to a bit about what Chris was talking about, which is, not doing versions, but just doing lots of random changes and throwing it up there every 5 minutes. You don't know what version you're testing against. It's technically you can test it, but you actually got no control over what you're testing. So actually the testability goes down. It's one of those things that I think is really, really complicated, and it is in effect the essence of testing. And I got asked the other day, how do you measure if we're good at it or bad at it? And I went, oh, great.
What good and bad at testability?
Yes. How do we measure our testability? What's our testability score?
That's an interesting one. Did you use a word like feedback? Would that be a useful place to go?
I didn't, but yeah, feedback loops, I think, was continuous feedback and things like that was definitely part of it. The answer is there isn't one answer to that sort of thing. There is lots of facets to it, and it depends, as we've just said, which is a really get out of jail free answer.
Because the other thing about testability is that it needs to be controllable, but also it needs to be adaptable as well, because the whole constraints of testing and keeping relevant change over time, because the software itself that you are testing changes. And if you're doing sort of web-based things, the browsers that you're using, the phones, everything changes around it. So actually the testability has to change with the different features that are introduced and the context in which it's actually been tested on.
I think that's an interesting one, because you can take a component of code and you can test that in isolation of anything else. You can join a component of code to another component of code, and you can test that and grow and grow and grow. And there's the interesting thing is with testability, I suppose, and it falls into the point about relevance, is it's also about effort and not necessarily repeating yourself or changing. If I know that it works in isolation, that's just proving that the engine's put together. But if I put it together, it's now going to start the car, and it wider and wider and wider, depending on what environment you're testing in, what other things are plugged in around it. The team that you're working with could be part of a multi-stream project. So your inputs and your outputs are changing as well, because those things are changing in and around you. So your testability, the testability of what started off as an isolated piece of code, is one part of several other moving bits in and around it. Testability is great, and the ability to test small bits and manage risk around that is fine. But everybody else around you is doing exactly the same thing. So they're all testing their bits in the small and testing things working together. So at what point are you? It's like it's the age-old thing of when are you done? So are you done when you're done, or are you done when everybody around you is done as well?
Yeah, and it goes further, doesn't it? In some ways, like, does it reach the business goal? Has it reached the business outcomes? So it goes into kind of the user statistics, observability of the live system, potentially the financial metrics of a company. You could argue that that will tell you whether something's been successful or not, something has delivered what's expected or not. So it is boundless, because testing is that sort of verification of something meets an expectation, for want of a better description. But it's interesting, the facets in it. Like, have you got the right resources? So if you've got something isn't testable if you need to use certain tools you don't have, but you need to use them and you haven't got skills in them, for example. It's the people then that don't have necessarily the side of the skills to do it. Not necessarily the software, it's the environment the software is operated within. Sometimes the tools aren't the problem. Sometimes it's the classic one I come across a lot is environments, and designing the right environmental structure or disposable environments sort of thing to be able to deliver what's needed to be done, or the right integration environments, non-integration, the right mocks. It does depend on context, because if I was doing a unit of code, I wouldn't be integrating it to an entire full stack of applications. But you need to be able to consider those things, and the architecture. The amount of architecture reviews I might have been to where they talk about the live system. It's like, well, yeah, how will this work in a non-live system? How do we validate it? How do we maintain it? It's all great, that's wonderful in prod, but what about getting it to prod? It's often overlooked. Is there any things that you maybe would think of early in projects to consider when trying to think about making sure that what's coming down the line is testable? Is there any questions you'd ask, any prompts you'd do, any pitches you might make to try and persuade people to invest in a bit of pre-planning versus just dump it on testers and let them figure it out?
I think understanding it's a design's place in the solution. So you may be in a world where not everything that your solution has is developed in house. You may have third party suppliers, you may have other systems that you integrate with as outputs or whatever it is. So understanding it, but the bit that you're doing, for example, that's your, for want of a better word, the natively developed bit within your organization. Building the picture of what the solution's going to look like and where this is going to sit and what its dependencies are, then you can start to figure out what testing you can do earlier. So, for example, like, is the engine put together properly? Okay, cool. But also, therefore, what you're dependent upon, so that you're not necessarily wasting time testing something that is going to change. Because it's like the what three words around testing, and that I did in a previous context. And one of the words comes back as is like it's costly. Well, great, but how do you drive the cost down? Is to be efficient about when you test and what you test. Now, testing early you could say is cost efficient. That's cool, but waiting until the very end can actually be really expensive. If you do no testing and just wait till absolutely everything is delivered, that's an expensive way to live as well. So it's kind of like figuring out about what the most cost efficient way and the risks that you run around what you test early, what you don't test early, what you're waiting for. And then as the other bits slot together. It's building out journeys between the things that you're expecting in order to actually, so that you're not waiting until the very end. That you're building out what I call system testing in the small rather than system testing in the large. I'm testing this journey. I'm now testing this journey when this comes along. I'm waving around with my arms. Sorry, I'm trying to do a diagram with my fingers and nobody can see. But it's about figuring out when certain things land to know that that journey is possible versus I'm just going to test it even though I know it's going to change. Well, if you know it's going to change, you're going to come back there anyway. So, but you've got to keep those feedback loops going. So what can you test now? What can you put off? And it's the risks that you run between the two. So some of it is risk mapping, really, as well. It's those, what risks am I running now? What risks will I run later?
Also, I think that as part of that, the whole testability is to get to understand the design, get involved in the design process in the beginning, understand what they are trying to produce, and also what good looks like, or what expectation of quality. What does the client want? What does the customer want? What to what quality do they want it? Because then you can build in that particular thing. You highlighted also another point that came to me is that obviously with highly complex projects, we might be working in things in different areas. And you say you might have third party things coming in. And so it's making sure that when you are writing your tests, you're planning for things. You might be writing tests that are planned for the future or might partially pass at that time. But the expectation is that you will have new functionality. So making sure that you are one, and this is why we need to be involved in the design, is because if we know something is coming, we can preempt it and make sure that it is maintainable going forwards, because we can add things to it and know what features need to be added. So we have those sort of stubs and things that allow us to extend it when possible.
You've all inspired me to get my TestSphere deck out. There is a quality aspect section in the TestSphere deck of cards, and there's a testability card. And lo and behold, it is a maintainability aspect. Just to what we've just been talking about, it seems to fit really nicely. This is everything and anything that impacts how easy or hard your testing efforts are. And then the three TestSphere examples they have are cheat codes are often ways to test a game more easily. If you want to test being all powerful, just enter up, down, 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 left, right, BA, start, select. Don't forget, it's a shortcut. 2, can you manipulate a system to test functionality that only comes into play at certain times? And 3, do you have enough environments to test on? Which Russell, of course, mentioned earlier. What do you use them for? Is it clear for every team member? And I think that, we've been on quite a similar thread throughout this. There is this maintainability, there's relevance, there's capacity. Shift left, yes, but not always. Feedback loops and such. So I found that quite interesting how it all sort of aligns quite nicely.
Yeah. Shift left just reminded me exactly. It's the exact opposite. It's also shift right. As in, it's testable to be able to put something into production behind a flag, grow things into it. That's getting user feedback, but that's still testability. The ability to do that is a way to validate assumptions early rather than just big bang approaches. So testability has so many facets and directions.
And when we were testing smart meters, David and I, we didn't always get to run real life current through a test unit that we had. We would have to have testable elements that would create fictitious current and such to go through, so we could have a meter not take an entire cal source home with us, and all of the isolation transformers and other bits of kit. We could actually have that and test that the software was behaving correctly, even when there wasn't the broader interactive hardware and stuff. That's a great example of something that made it testable for us to be able to use those things as well.
Yeah. I've just thought of an example of the opposite of testability, or how you know something isn't got good testability, which is when someone says they're going to make a change to X and everyone goes and groans and goes, oh, don't want to touch that. Oh, that'll be weeks of work. Oh, that'll be horrible. Because the application in itself, it may be a simple item that you want, but the whole area around it is so pickled with holes and technical debt and all sorts, and it could be the unit test coverage, it could be all sorts of different things, but no one wants to go near it with a barge pole or they can't understand it. And I would argue if you don't understand code, that impacts what it does when you're making changes to it. That impacts your ability to be able to validate it works because you
Part
don't
of the
actually know what
feedback
you're
as well,
broken.
isn't it? It's the
Yeah.
feedback and understandability as well as testability. And if something is flaky and no one understands how it works and it does those things, that is exactly
Well,
the opposite.
the way I describe it is if you make a small change, but then you have to go broad brush to figure out what's happening, then your application isn't easily testable. As in, you might be able to run tests on it easily, but actually you can't figure out what's changing and how it works and impacts things. So you're having to do inefficient testing by doing scatterguns and broad. Regression test everything is the sentence that comes in my head. Whereas I made one small change, do everything. That would suggest that you might have tests, but actually your system isn't very testable because you can't figure out what might be the area that's changed. And that, again, it's all different facets of the same sort of thing, isn't it? Because it's like, how do you isolate the component, the integration? And if you can't, generally your impact zone, your risk grows.
But that's an interesting thing, isn't it? When we're talking about, oh yeah, regression test everything. Do you stop actually covering the thing that you actually want to test because you're now going broad brush? So you're now into 100% tested doesn't mean 100% covered. So you're now into, have you tested it? Yeah, but we also had to test everything else. And we only had a week. So we're into the realms now of how isolatable is your change
Exactly.
and your inputs and your outputs and your dependencies within whatever system you are around anything else. And if you can't isolate the change down, you're now running risk
But you
across
also,
the entire solution because you have no control. We've got control issues again
yeah,
because we don't really have control over the change that we're making.
yeah, but you mentioned another one at the time. Like, something is much more testable if I have infinite time. I'll get to it. I'll be able to do everything eventually. But actually, in reality, is you don't have infinite time. You have to do some limitations. You either limit people, resources, coverage, the risks. But if someone says to you, you've got a week, I could argue that impacts your testability of your application by constraint. It's interesting how the term, the meaning is impacted by so many different things, isn't it?
We got a lot of things we could have talked about. We didn't talk about readability and many other things, but we have come to the end of our time allotted, friends. Thank you very much. Thank you, Al, for joining us again. Hope to have you on again soon.
Pleasure.
Thank you, team. Thank you to everyone that's already excited about next month's Testing Peers Conference. We're very excited to see you again in Nottingham on March 13th. If you haven't got your ticket, they are, of course, still available at testingpeerscon.com. Al graced the stage last year. He was very wonderful on our main stage, and we were very, very proud to have him there and a part of our community. So, friends, please, we love your feedback. Get in touch. LinkedIn, Blue Sky, not really anywhere else. You can email us at contactUs@testingpeers.com. Please like, share, tell your friends. We're on YouTube now. Get involved. Send us your ideas for things you'd like us to talk about. And otherwise, we will see you next time.
For now, it's goodbye from the Testing Peers.
Goodbye.